Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be continuing development of our web application, incorporating some of the concepts we've learned in our last few lessons. First, we're going to start off by reviewing what our last version of the web app looked like, which was version 6.2, and then we're going to go through two revisions in this lesson. We're going to upgrade to a version 7.0 and a version 7.1. Now, in version 7.2, one of the things I wanted to note was that we don't actually do any get data evaluation or validation. So, for example, on checkout.php, item.php, and thankyou.php, all of those scripts accept get parameters. And what they do is they access the data in those get parameters without really checking to see if they're available. So as a result, if you go directly to any of those pages, you actually get a warning from PHP saying you're trying to access a get variable that doesn't exist. And in addition, the page doesn't work as it's supposed to. So for example, if we actually go and look at version 6.2, and here's what it looks like if we go to store.php. Let's actually decrease it a little bit. But if we were to go, for example, directly to checkout.php, we get an error at the beginning saying undefined index items. And that's because we're trying to access in our code the items array. And for example, if we go directly to items.php, we're going to get an error as well. And if you'll notice, none of the item information actually shows up down here on the screen, saying that you're trying to access an item ID that wasn't provided. And if we actually go and look at the code, for example, for this page, this is the 6.2 version of item.php. We can see the very first line of our code here, or well, the second statement in our code. We create a variable called current item ID, and we set it equal to get item ID. Now, instantly, because if we go to item.php without providing an item ID get variable, this is going to generate an error because this variable doesn't exist because it wasn't passed in. And in addition, because we use this current item ID variable in different parts of our page to basically look up item information from the catalog, none of that is going to work as well. So it has the implications of generating an error as well as not allowing the script to function as it should. So what we're going to do is in version 7.0, we're going to make use of if-else statements that we learned about. We're going to use the isSet construct that we've learned about. Basically, what we're going to do is some basic validation on our get variables. And what we're going to do is we're going to test that any get variables that are required by a particular script, in this case checkout.php, item.php, and thankyou.php, we're going to verify that those variables actually exist and were passed in, and we're going to use that using the isSet function. And if they're not set, we're going to set them to null by default. Then what we're going to do is, when we do this process of checking to see if they're available, we're going to create short variables or short forms of these get variables, which is something that you commonly do in PHP because it's a lot easier to write, for example, $item ID than $_get square brackets item ID. So it's a way to make it easier to use the variables within your code without sort of clouding it up with unnecessary syntax. So we're going to create these short variables when we validate them, and then we're going to use them to conditionally output HTML content of the page. And what that means is we're going to be, if the appropriate get variables were provided, we're going to output the content of the page as we're supposed to. If not, we're going to output an error message. And one thing in particular we're going to do is we're going to make use of our AND operator, logical AND operator, which we learned about in the validation of our get data for thankyou.php. We're also going to divide each of these three pages into different sections, and we're going to use comments to do that. And basically what that's going to do is sort of separate out functionality of the page, and it makes the pages easier to understand. When you go back and look at the pages, you'll know, okay, at the top of the page is where the get variables are always processed. At the bottom of the page is where the HTML output always occurs. So let's actually go take a look first at item.php, and this was the old item.php, and let's see what it looks like in an updated version. Basically, at the top of the page, we've added a new section, and the way I've demarcated a section is just by adding this comment tag that says process get variables. And what that's going to do is this section is going to be used to create the short variables for our get variables, and also to check to make sure that they are valid. So for example, we have our if-else statement, which we just learned about a few lessons ago, and we basically run the isSet function on get item ID. And if get item ID exists and it's set, then we set current item ID to that value. If not, we set it equal to null. Then what we go ahead and do is I've created a section. If you look in our old item.php, after we've made a short version of our get variable, we did a little processing on it. For example, we look up the current item in the item catalog. We set the page title for the page. Well, I've created a section called perform any global data processing. And in this section, these sort of actions that occur after the get variables or the short get variables are created, this section will contain them. And basically, you can see there's another if-else statement in here. And it's going to make use of the fact that we've created these short variables and we've validated whether or not they were actually input. So for example, to avoid that error that we got on previous pages, what we've done is check to see if current ID was not equal to null, because if the ID was set to null, that means that it wasn't passed in. And if it was, then we go ahead and look up the item in the catalog. And actually, this line shouldn't even be here, because we've actually done that up here. We've created the short variable up here at the top of the page. And so what this tests is if the current ID isn't equal to null, that means it was passed in, and it's set to the value item ID that was passed in, and then we can look up our item in the catalog and we can set the name. However, if this statement evaluates to false, which means that it was null, which means that an ID was not passed in, then we're going to set the page title to say error. Down here we've created a section called output HTML, and this is where all of the HTML is going to be output, conditionally output from now on, and that's going to be based on this data processing that occurred at the top of the page. So for example, now whereas before we just would output the HTML header in our old version and then go straight ahead and output all of the information about the item, we have a conditional statement. We have an if statement that says if current item ID is not equal to null, which again references the fact that it was passed in, then we go ahead and output all of the item's information. But we add an else statement at the end. So if item ID is equal to null, which means it wasn't passed in, then we output an error message that says you have reached this page in error. So if we actually go and look at, again, this is what item ID look like on item.php looks like on version 6.2. You get these errors now, and that's because we haven't provided a query string. For example, if we went ahead and provided, then we get the functionality as expected. Let's go back and look at the new version, 7.0. And now when we go directly to item.php, we actually get an error message. And that's because it's processing the get variable and saying, okay, you didn't actually present a get variable called item ID, so we're going to generate an error. Now we've also done this for the other pages in the website, for the other pages that take get variables. For example, checkout.php. If we go to checkout.php without any get variables, we get the same message, you've reached this page in error. And if we manually go to thankyou.php, we're going to get reach this page in error as well. If we go back and look at the code, let's look at the code for checkout.php, for example. You can see we've added this section again up here at the top about processing the get variables. We performed the similar isSet test on the variable, the get variable items to make sure it was passed in, and if not, we set our short variable cart items equal to null. Then if we go down here to do our data processing, and in this case, because it's the checkout script actually calculates the total, if our cart items is not equal to null, which means that it was a valid get variable is passed in, then we go ahead and do the calculations, because if we didn't have a valid get variable, there's no reason to try and calculate them. And then we have the else statement that says if the cart items was equal to null, if it wasn't passed in, then we're going to output an error page. Down here we have the HTML output section, and again we have an if statement that tests whether or not the short get variable exists, meaning that it was passed in. If it does exist, we go ahead and output the shopping cart total that was calculated in the processing section, and information, or the form that accepts information about the customer's shipping and billing address. Now, if there was an error, meaning that the get variable was not passed in, then instead we would output an error message, which you just saw, which is you have reached this page in error. Now in thankyou.php, we have the same similar concept, except that in thankyou.php, there's actually two get variables that we access. We access the the variable customer and get order total. And actually, I can see here that I'm supposed to have this in here. And what this does is this actually checks that that the customer get variable was set and this is where we're making use of the AND operator, the AND logical operator, that the order total was set. Because we want to make sure before we access these variables further down in the script that they are available. And if not, we set them equal to null. So here we've created the short form of the variables. And then down here in the data processing section, we have our logical operator again, and it's saying if both customer data is not equal to null and order data, or excuse me, order total is not equal to null, then we're going to go ahead and set the page title to thank you, and that's going to mean that we're going to process the pages normally. If neither of these, or if either of these were equal to null, we're going to generate an error, and here we set the page title equal to error. Then we have the output HTML section. Again, we have a conditional test to decide whether to output the regular HTML of the page, the regular HTML content, or an error message. And the test we have again is if either of the get variables, if both of them were not equal to null, meaning they both existed, then we're going to go ahead and output our order information like we've done before, where we output the date of the order, the sales tax that was used, the order total, and so forth. And then also we echo the address. And if not, we have the else statement down here that says you have reached this page in error. And so that was what we saw when we looked at these pages in the browser. For example, again, if we refresh thankyou.php, we get an error. Whereas, let's say we go through the application as we're supposed to. And go to complete order. Now our thank you page is output as appropriate because you can see up at the top here we have the appropriate get variables that were passed in from the form. And this is the page we had developed in the last lesson. So now we're going to change things a little bit. We're going to upgrade to a version 7.1. And basically what we're going to do in this lesson is make a couple of simple changes. We're going to replace the if-else statements we used to process the get variables at the top of the page. And we're going to replace them with simpler and cleaner looking ternary operations. And we're going to show you that in a second. Additionally, we're going to add the error reporting function to our config.php file, which, as you know, is the configuration file that we include in all of our pages on the website. And what that's going to allow us to do is, because we're developing, we can go into that config.php file and override the global error reporting settings that our PHP configuration has set up, and that'll give us flexibility while we're developing to experiment with different error levels. And it does it in an easy way because we don't have to edit php.ini and we don't have to restart Apache. So in this one we're actually going to be editing the config.php to make that change, to add the error reporting, and then in these three here we're going to be updating the way the get variables are processed to use ternary operators. So actually version 7.1 is going to look the same as version 7.0, and if we go to any of the thank you page or checkout page, go to any of these pages directly, we get the error as we're supposed to. However, let's see. Let's pull up this is an old version, the 7.0 version of thankyou.php, and if we go ahead and open up the 7.1 version, at the beginning of thankyou.php in 7.0, when we process the get variables, we have this if-else statement up here, and it's saying that if these variables are set, then go ahead and set their value to the value that was passed in. If not, set that to null. We can do that a little bit simpler using ternary statements or a ternary operation. So instead of that if else block, we can set customer data, and we set it equal to the customer value that was passed in. If is set, yes, customer is true, means if it was passed in, we set it to the value, and if not, we set it equal to null. Likewise, for order total, if the order total is set, if it was passed in, we set the value of order total, the short variable order total, equal to the value that's passed in, and if not, we set it equal to null. And as you can see, this cleans things up a little bit, makes things a little bit easier to read, and is a pretty simple operation. So that's how we use the ternary variables, and we actually do that on, the ternary operators, and we actually do that on item.php and checkout.php as well, where we've replaced the if-else statement at the top with a ternary operation in checkout.php for the cart item short variable, and for current item ID in item.php. So as mentioned, the other change that we made is we added at the bottom, this is at the top, if we go all the way down to the bottom of config.php, we've added a section for error reporting, and we've added this error reporting function, which, as we know, overrides the default PHP configurations error reporting level. And in this case, we're going to set it to the development value all or strict, which means output all error messages, and then also, in addition, any notices that that fall under the strict category. And this is actually the value that's set by default in the examp php.ini file. So what we're actually going to do is go ahead to make this error reporting function actually do something useful. We're going to go ahead and edit our php.ini file to make it more restrictive, to put it on, for example, a production value, or in this case, we're going to set it to the default value, which says I want to report all errors except for the notices, except for notice. And that's different from all or strict, because in the all or strict, the notices get output. So in this case, when we set this global file like this, and we go ahead and restart Apache, it's going to have this new error level that's going to report less errors. And so now when we go to our config.php file, because this is included in every page, it actually gets set back to this development level. Now in the real world, you may or may not do this. You may actually just go ahead and edit the php.ini configuration file. The point I'm kind of putting that in here is to get practice with using this error reporting method, and to see how it can be used, because maybe sometimes you won't actually have access to the php.ini file on whatever server you're working on, and so this will allow you to be able to do that. And so that's how we make use of the error reporting function. So for today's homework challenge, as usually with our web application lessons, I just want to make sure that you understand the different things. So the first thing is to make sure that you understand why we added the simple get input validation to our scripts, and that was because that way we don't get any warnings from PHP saying we're trying to access data that doesn't exist, and also it causes our scripts to not malfunction, like, for example, the item.php page that tried to access data that didn't exist, and you could see there were blank images, it didn't output the price, and so forth. And we actually made use of the if-else statement within our item.php page to actually only output the item's information if we know that an item ID was properly passed in. Otherwise, we output an error. Also, just want you to consider how dividing the page into different sections, and this will probably become a little more evident as we move on to future versions of the web application, how dividing it into sections based on functionality makes it a little bit easier to understand. When you go to the file now, you always know that in the current setup that the bottom section is going to always be where the HTML output occurs. So you know that if you're going to be looking for any HTML output, maybe you have an HTML output error, you're going to be looking down at the bottom. We know at the beginning there's the section where we process and create our short get variables, and then there's a section where we do data processing, and what that is doing is preparing the data for output in the HTML. So if maybe some of our data is bad, then we can know to go look in the data processing section. So that just makes things a little bit easier to maintain and debug, and aids in other people that would end up reading your files as well. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.